for including this. Worker is always one of my favorite conferences of the year, so always happy to be here and present. This is with my excellent co-authors, Nicholas Padilla and Anya Lambrick at LBS, and my colleague Brett Hollenbeck at UCLA. I'm going to be talking about the impact of LLM adoption on online behavior. It's probably not a stretch to say the way we're searching for information is changing, or probably just has changed already. You know, pre-LLM world, you might search for information. You're going on a trip, 5-day itinerary on Tokyo. This is what you might see. Let's click into the second listing here. It's a blog by Janice Rawlinson. There's information about, how you should plan a trip to Japan. And this is how we, access the information pre-LLMs. What's also important here is the process of searching for information and then potentially entering one of these sites and landing on this page, because you'll see at the very bottom, there's an ad here. And that's a very important part of how pre-LLM internet worked. The quid pro quo of Google collecting all of this information and surfacing it at the risk of some people just seeing the information on the search results page and leaving, is that some people will click through to the actual websites and provide some ad revenue to these content creators who are supplying information for free, right? Post LLM, what we're probably doing is going to ChatGPT, asking it to plan an itinerary, finding that it's very customizable and personalizable and has much better outcomes, and substituting away from traditional search engines for these types of tasks. And so that breaks this quid pro quo. There's no ad revenue being compensating the source of this information, although of course people are thinking about how to fix that. We're really just trying to document, is the substitution away from traditional search engines happening in this particular paper. This isn't a new thing. Lots of people have noticed it. People talk about the zero-click internet. What happens when people aren't actually clicking around the internet? It's all agents searching for information, recovering it, and that really breaks this ad revenue model the internet relied on. And this has real stakes. Chegg is a education website that supplies a lot of students go to. They're suing Google for Google AI Overview because they're finding that they're losing traffic to their websites. We're not talking about AI Overview. We have some people in the room who look at AI Overview as well. Our particular time frame is going to be 2022 and 2023, and I'll set the scene as to what things look like back then. So ultimately, we're thinking LLMs are transforming the way that we search for information. In principle, LLMs could be complements to traditional search engines. Substitution is probably the more likely story, but you could imagine the LLM surfaces enough information that allows you to do your own search or deeper search of information. I know, at least for me, I was sick maybe like a few months back for the first time since LLMs were available. Prior to LLMs, I wouldn't have bothered with WebMD. I couldn't interpret it, certainly not when I was sick, but I quite happily went on ChatGPT and Googled my symptoms and thought, oh, I can understand what WebMD is saying. I'm checking the information. In principle, it could be complex. And so that's kind of our overarching question. To do this, we're going to try to look at outcome variables associated with the entire journey of searching for information. And so we're going to see when people adopt LLMs, and we're going to code up adoption in a way that I'll explain in a little bit. When they adopt LLMs, how do their search activity change? Their browsing activity to actual websites change? And then importantly, for completing this loop about the ad revenue model of the internet, do they see less ads as a result? And then if I get time, I can talk about some domain-specific effects. So what's happening to education-based websites and what's happening to user-generated content websites. Just a preview of the approach that we're taking. We're going to code up adoption. That's going to be our treatment at the user or household level. We're going to be using ComScore data for 2022 and 2023. This is going to motivate a staggered diff and diff approach to understanding LLM adoption.
So question, and I don't know how it works, but I know that companies like TripAdvisor are integrated in ChatGPT now, right?
TripAdvisor, yeah.
Yeah, they have this plugin. I don't know how it works. So is this traffic that goes to TripAdvisor or is traffic that stays in ChatGPT? So I'm able to separate the plugin traffic.
Yeah, I want to say it wasn't that apparent at this particular time period, but with this data, it would show up as TripAdvisor first, but there would be a call to ChatGPT, and data of this type would be able to observe it.
Because I think the platform now, they realize that they're losing traffic, so they're creating this plugin or whatever they're called.
Yeah.
The chat.
And certainly, especially these days, there's a lot more effort from LLM providers to link to external websites because they're aware of the concerns of the website and the slurping up of information. So for this time period, I'll talk a little bit about where we think things are. Key preview of key findings. What we're going to find is people decrease their use of traditional search engines like Google and Bing. It's going to be quite specific as to what types of searches that we see decreases in. No overall browsing activity change, but if we look at the heterogeneity across websites, actually niche websites see quite a large decrease in traffic. And that's probably concerning for the provision of specific types of information. We do see people are exposed to fewer ads, and so that's important. And it's going to turn out to be concentrated amongst people who are high retail users. We find negative effects on education, but generally no effects on user-generated contents.
In your data, do you see URL level data, or do you actually see the page?
We see the URL level there.
So your ad exposure is inferred
ad exposure inferred from a call to Google's ad services network.
Oh, so you see the calls too?
Yes.
And you see how many times and how many ads actually got rendered?
Yeah, it can be a little bit difficult because there's a call to start the auction, and then when the ad gets served, there might be another call, but we see all of those. And then mostly we're focusing on reporting results as a percentage, which helps with some of the issue with whether you're actually seeing 20 ads or it's 2 ads and 10 calls each. You found
from the similar discussions earlier about aggregators. Is there a degree of substitution that's strong enough so that's or are you primarily just looking for a sign that there is substitution?
So you're talking about TripAdvisor type aggregators
or news aggregators?
Or news aggregators. So we won't find an effect on news, at least for this particular situation. So we haven't thought too much about what the implications of that for aggregators specifically. Maybe when I come back to the user-generated content, I can double back on the thoughts about this. Yeah.
Can you infer ad blocker usage?
So we didn't do it, but I think we can because it depends. Some types of ad blockers will make it so that a website doesn't call out, and so I suspect the percentage of people is pretty low in our sample. ComScore is a panel of pretty less sophisticated internet users, I would say. But in principle, yes, you can try to recover whether they're using ad blockers if it's of the type that prevents an ad call going out. Because you can see websites that typically have lots of ad calls, but for a particular user doesn't have.
I'm just wondering if the people using ad blockers are maybe the ones more likely to adopt language models earlier.
Yeah, I think there's probably some, there's going to be selection into adoption for sure, and I'll talk a little bit about how we think about that. All right, there's great literature in here. I know Hang Chang and Rong in the room have some work on looking at AI reviews that's related, but I'm going to skip it for interest of time. I'm going to be talking about the empirical data, looking at the estimation strategy, reporting the results. Okay, so just to set the scene, 2022 and 2023 is ancient history in LLM world. At that particular point, November was kind of the big spike in interest because ChatGPT was being released and there was massive adoption. During the middle of our period, there is some model release updates happening. There are some features that allow live search as part of LLM queries, but on the whole, live search wasn't available. And so there's a knowledge cutoff problem, well, limitation with LLMs. That's going to motivate some of our controls because we're worried about, general activity. So in particular, with the knowledge cutoff, you wouldn't be using an LLM to ask what the Dodgers score yesterday was. They lost, unfortunately. No AI overview either during this period. For all of these, you can kind of argue what the exact timing of the date is because there's a lot of beta testing. Some subset of individuals might have access to some of these, but this is how we're kind of interpreting these timelines. We're using the ComScore web traffic panel. There's a lot of different versions of this ComScore data out there. We observe the full URL. It's going to be US panelists. We have the full 2 years, but our sample period is going to be the 1 year period from November 2022 onwards. So we see the full URL, which means we see the search queries on traditional search engines. We're not going to observe the querying that goes on LLMs. So really, we're just measuring, is there a decline in traditional search engines, with the assumption being there's substitution towards LLMs. There's various website categorization methods that we use, including ComScore's own one, to classify websites. In particular, with this raw data, there's a lot of just spurious web activity calls going back and forth, and we do a lot to parse out genuine visits to a website as opposed to background calls. But because of all the background calls, we also observe the ad impressions that are going on. This is only going to be for Google though. So like Google, you can tell separately whether it's a call to an ad network. For things like Facebook ads and Amazon ads, those URL calls are hard to disentangle from just normal website activity. So we're going to focus on the Google, but Google is very important for the open web. We do need to be very careful about how we use this particular panel. It starts out as 200,000 panelists, but really a lot of those panelists don't have good, genuine activity. If we focus, and there's obviously attrition, we're going to focus on the set of individuals that have at least 4 URL activity per month in our sample period. That restricts our sample down to around 70,000 individuals. And then from that, we only really want to focus on the individuals who are actually genuinely adopting LLMs and regularly using LLMs. We're going to pick the particular adoption definition that's 3 consecutive weeks of usage, at which point we code you up as having adopted at the beginning of those 3 consecutive weeks of usage. And obviously we vary this and the directions are the same, but standard errors can move around. Alex.
Just to clarify, do you observe like the desktop app usage, or is it only browser usage of the LLM?
So the ComScore data is, you can think of it as sitting at the router, and it's measuring all the web activity calls that are occurring. So we will see calls to ChatGPT, calls to Anthropic wasn't really here. It really is just ChatGPT during this period. So we observe web activity calls, but for LLMs, we don't observe anything about the queries entered into LLMs.
You would observe usage of the desktop app.
Oh, yes, as well. Yes, that would count. Richard.
Curious how fan-tailed browsing activity is in general. So do you have some statistic of what top X% of individuals make up 50% of all the browsing activity?
There's definitely a lot of heterogeneity. I don't have the results for the 70,000. Are you worried about, as we are cutting down the sample, whether we're focusing on individuals who heavily use websites versus
or I'm wondering if you could even disclose how shifting just some few crazy power users. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's also just bias from.
Yeah, no, that's something we should do a little bit more to check. Maybe we did it at one point, I'm forgetting, but
I guess I don't know. It's probably my own bias, but 4 active days per month. seems like a lot lower than what I.
Oh, okay, yeah. We've definitely varied that number. We did want to allow a pretty low number just in case people are just going on holidays and then, yeah, that's just, but we can do a little bit better and like actually figuring out whether this is grabbing individuals who just don't have much activity. That's fair. Okay, so this means we're only in our sample for the staggered diff and diff comparing currently treated individuals to not yet treated individuals. There's never any never treated individuals. We think this is a good trade-off. You know, it's going to be an average treatment effect on the treated, but you know, the main source of concern here is selection into using or adopting LLMs according to this definition is highly endogenous. At least we're going to focus on the set of individuals comparing self-selecting into using LLMs at a later period during this time period versus in the earlier time period. When I show you some of the adoption statistics, we think, you know, it's mostly going to be exogenous reasons driving adoption timing within this time period for this set of individuals, but happy to discuss. There's definitely potentially lots of stories we could tell where things are going to be contaminated.
The viewers are thanks.
You want to hear all this?
The viewers are going to be, I'm going to envelope.
Yes, let's discuss. Okay. First up, you know, we're worried about attrition when we're using these types of samples and when we're filtering down to our 2000. Oh, one thing to mention, 2000 individuals out of 75, that's like 3-4% of our individuals. This, I think some people think that's actually quite small during this period. You know, I would agree. I would say we are focusing on individuals who use it quite heavily, consistently across 3 weeks. If you look at some of the OpenAI kind of reporting, they don't report direct statistics for US, etc. You know, some assumptions around it might put 10% of US users are using ChatGPT actively. What we see in our data actually is if we relax this 3 weeks, we actually gain a lot more individuals, but a lot of these individuals use it very heavily for 1 week, and then we don't see them again using LLMs for the rest of the time period. We don't know what they're doing, obviously, on the LLM, even though we know the search activity queries on traditional search engines. But I know certainly I had some relatives that, you know, found out about ChatGPT and like said they had 10-hour conversations with ChatGPT. Was like so amazed, but I don't think they ever went back and changed their actual behavior. When we filter down to these 2000 individuals, we still have consistent activity across our time period. So a little bit of good signs there. Let me show you some summary statistics. This is also going to give you a sense of some of the outcome variables that I'll show you a little bit later. Obviously, we're interested in search. We're going to be able to break it down by various types of search. An average individual here is going to make 37 searches in a week. All our stuff is going to be at the individual week level. They're visiting around 4,000 pages. So these are actual hits of pages. It's not 4,000 separate websites. So if you're on Facebook and you scroll down and it triggers a load of new information, that counts as another hit in this data. We can look at traffic that's actually referred from Google search and Bing search. That's particularly important because we're worried about this disintermediation of these websites by LLMs. Ads, I've told you about. We can split up ads a little bit as well to different types of ads, search ads versus display ads on specific websites. We also have some controls. So we observe when people check their emails, go to news websites, and go to retail websites. These are all things we don't think should be affected by LLMs during this period. And we can run our staggered diff and diff on this and verify there's no detectable effects for these things. And so we're going to also use them as potential controls. Including and excluding controls, we actually get the same thing. So if you're not happy with controls, the results hold. We have a lot of young audiences, young individuals in our sample adopting. And so education is a particular important category. That's going to be like 170 calls on average to education-related websites. And then we have some specific websites there as well. So let me show you the timing of adoption for our 2,000 individuals across our 1-year period. The blue or the light blue is going to be OpenAI. So this is really during this period, it's just ChatGPT. These are kind of layman users. They hear about ChatGPT, they go to ChatGPT. There's a little bit of spike during when Bing Chat kind of made it very easy to access their, I guess it's now called Copilot. I can't remember what it's called at that point. But if you did a search on Bing, it would actually, like Google AI Overview, show you results from OpenAI's ChatGPT through their partnership. So there's a little bit of spike there, but for the majority of our users, it is just ChatGPT adoption. And I would say that adoption is pretty even across the time period. This would be suggestive of some exogenous factors driving adoption. It's not guaranteed for sure.
Do you use it as an exogenous shock in estimations?
The spike?
Yeah.
No. We've separately looked at those individuals. That's just not Okay, so people adopt across the timing period. I'm just splitting up that adoption on the right panel by the number of weeks they are post LLMs, just to show you, when we're constructing those staggered diff and diff, for a particular time period, we're going to be comparing individuals who have adopted to individuals who have not yet adopted. And that's going to mean that, especially when we're focusing on the very long-term effects, there's going to be less cohorts there to serve as control groups and treatment groups. So be wary of very wide standard errors for those tails. Okay, so it's going to be a staggered diff and diff for obvious reasons. We're going to construct cohort group level, group time level, average treatment effects on the treated, and then aggregate them up in various different ways to show you the results.
Could you remind me why you don't have never treated?
So we think that there's just a lot of endogeneity of the never treated relative to the treated. So we're comparing individuals who, during this period, are happy to self-select into LLMs. The other part is, even though we do the filter of 4 units of activity every month, we think there's a lot of individuals there in the panel that aren't genuine activity.
As a follow-up, do you also include never treated?
So never treated, standard errors are a little bit wider. And we do interpret that as we're including a lot of noise into the estimates. We can do varying things technically, because our 1-year sample doesn't end. We can, the very late adopters are never treated in some way. Those results are very consistent. Okay, as I mentioned, there's going to be controls for email, retail, and news activity, which we don't think is being affected during this period. These are time-varying controls, and so there's various reasons we might not want to put time-varying controls inside a diff and diff. But as I said, the results are consistent with that. So we're constructing for each group time treatment effect, we're collecting all the individuals in the same calendar time, comparing a treated group to a set of not yet treated groups. What are the main assumptions for this? Conditional parallel trends, or the main 2, no anticipation. We do vary the anticipation, allowing for anticipation, and those are consistent. What are the things robust to? Or in a simple, same as what's in a simple 2-way fixed effect, calendar time effects are going to be different out. Obviously, during holiday seasons, web activity is going to swing dramatically. Level differences across the cohorts that aren't due to unobservables is going to be accounted for. So one of the reasons we're focusing on people who did eventually adopt LLMs during this period is that will hopefully soak up a lot of the potential, well, it minimizes the differences here that will affect our treatment effect. Constructing it from group time treatment effects allows us to look at heterogeneity, assuming the conditional parallel trends holds, obviously, but we don't see too much in the heterogeneity, which is a soft test for whether there's differences between early adopters and late adopters. And okay, so let's actually get to the results. This is just the typical event study graph. Yes, let's take a question first. Shanto.
So what are the control variables?
Email, retail, and news. And we've done tests on them separately to show there's no treatment effects when we do the staggered different.
And another question, do you know if there's like the ones with like stocks, say LLM with their treatment on?
Yeah, so definitely there are still people, given our definitions, that stop using LLMs. We haven't gone deep into trying to do a treated, untreated design methodology, but that's something we could explore. I know for sure I also sometimes bounced off these tools and went back and came back, so it might be interesting to explore. Okay, a few things to note with this event study. We don't think there's any evidence of pre-trends in the pre-period. There is an activity spike for around 3 weeks right after our adoption definition. And then remember, our adoption definition is the start of 3 consecutive weeks of usage. So, it's much like the activity bias in ad attribution type literatures. This event study is already controlling for those email, news, and retail. So actually the activity spike is much higher if we don't do that control. It lessens, but it doesn't eliminate entirely. We have some thoughts about what this is. It can be you're verifying the information you're getting on LLMs, but predominantly we're interested in the longer term trends. That's also where a lot of the potential stories that might confound our results are less likely to occur.
You don't see search queries, right?
I see the we should see the exact.
So you can check. You can check.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, so we don't see what they search on LLMs. If they search something on LLMs and they're confirming it on.
Maybe you could tell from the text.
Yeah.
They're making confirmatory questions as opposed to searching navigationally.
Yeah, so yeah, I think so. I would think it's not as clean as a test, but it's something I should. Yeah, we definitely looked at some of those search queries and go, yeah, it could be them confirming, but they could just be doing their regular searching, right? Okay, after the activity spike, we're going to see a decline. Standard errors are pretty wide. We're going to aggregate the dynamic treatment effects into buckets, really focusing on 20 weeks and after. That's going to be our main.
These are percentages, so the y-axis.
These are numbers. So search was 37, and so yeah, 40%, 20%. How?
What are errors going up because of attrition?
Yeah, because there's fewer cohorts to estimate those group time treatment effects.
Do you sort of worry about selection when you're looking at aggregate outcomes?
Yeah, so for when we're reporting the 20 weeks and plus, it's going to skew towards
survivors.
Yeah, the people who adopted early, because only the people who adopted early do we have observations, 48 months, 48 weeks and for attrition. It was a good thing. So they control later on. I already talked about that. So, okay, we're going to aggregate those into average treatment effects for 20 weeks to 47 weeks. All search goes down around 20%. Yes, most of this is from Google. Most people use Google, although within our sample, we actually skew a little bit more towards Bing and we can reweight. Because we see the search queries, we can look at what types of queries are affected by adoption of LLMs. Question type queries are any queries that contain the word what, where, how, why, like those interrogative phrases, and they see a pretty strong dramatic decrease in question searches. A lot of people use, moving to column 4, a lot of people use Google to just navigate to websites. People type in Amazon on Google to get to Amazon. Those types of queries see no changes in effects. And so that's a good placebo. We don't think LLMs are helping people navigate to Amazon. There are navigation plus other type searches. This is where the first term in the query is a website, but then it's followed by other things like questions. So like we think of these as someone Googling Reddit best tennis shoes, or as Shinto told me yesterday, Reddit best productivity apps. So those are informational searches, and we do see a decrease in those. We also played around with short, long queries and kind of a little bit more complexity. We didn't find strong differences between short and long as a proxy for the complexity of the query. And so these are kind of our main set of results for search. They're definitely the strongest one amongst the one I'm going to show you, at least in terms of standard errors.
Can I ask you a question? Do you have a sense of how persistent adoption is? Like, so you showed us in the previous graph that like there's 3 consecutive weeks. That's how you define adoption. Do they continue to use the LLMs that decline with maybe not? And if so, I don't think about those like longer term.
Yeah, so we could definitely instead of making it adoption as the treatment, do it as treatment intensity kind of following along. We haven't done that, but our sense is at least for the 3 weeks consecutive use, they do sustain their use quite a bit. But it's kind of a little bit hard because sometimes they do have months where there's no activity. We interpret that as holidays or things like that. Or they might be switching to other modes, which I think Tommaso might talk about.
Sort of a provocative question. And it's sort of orthogonal, feel free to talk about it. So basically what happens is there's an introduction of an imperfect substitute to incumbent technology. The incumbent share drops. So what am I to make of this one? Any decision making or policy, or what's the takeaway? What's the implication? And a related question is how perishable is this result? So when click-based ads came out, we saw click-through rates of 30%. Now we're below 0.5%. And so when we think about new technologies coming out again that display search, and will be very different results. So this is a data point, but I'm curious how you think we should, or who should react to these findings.
Yeah, so I don't think we're.
That's not a fair question.
No. I mean, so we want to document it in the way we documented that when LLMs were released, people are reducing the use of traditional search engines, and importantly, that this has flow-on effects for how information providers are actually compensated for providing information. And I do agree, things are going to adapt, and people are thinking of ways to compensate, LLM search of information, things like that. We're just really showing that, yes, when we do it using staggered diff and diff as much as causal as possible, we can see that effect happening. Yes.
So I have a question regarding the question searches, right? And I think there's some kind of nuance, the differences that let's say there are 2 types of questions. One is that with a very definitive answers, right? Say 1 + 1 = 2, right? And so another is up for debate, right? And there are back and forth and more discussions, and so there's not right or wrong answers. I think in that case, I think that if you ask GPT, right, and so the answers will be quite different. And also, I think the people they search this kind of questions in the traditional Google search and will behave differently, right? And so I don't know whether it's possible in the data for you to distinguish these 2 types of different questions, right? And because the reason is like say traditional, like say search one is like an information search. Right. Another type is So after the search, you basically resolve all the uncertainty. Another type of search is the uncertainty problem, even after extensive search, there's still unanswered parts. I think that will have different implications for how GPT enters the picture.
Yeah, I agree, especially like with the motivating example of the itinerary.
Yeah.
That's a very ongoing iterative
Yeah, exactly.
process. We haven't separated into that, but we can definitely look into like passing the actual queries a little bit more along those dimensions. In some sense, we want to dig into the search in another paper with more up-to-date data.
Okay.
Yeah. The event studies, if you were curious, Lena.
Just a couple quick thoughts on if you're trying to understand sort of like the earlier question on how are people searching information. Can you do some heterogeneity by just sort of type as in like baseline period? Are there high volume searches for users versus lower volume? And then over time, you also have variations on what's happening. So when something big happens, are people going to chat or
Yeah, I think the events one is really good. Yeah, because we haven't done much in terms of, there's going to be tons of things happening during this period that we can see how these are affected. On your first point, heterogeneity, I think we might have done some on heterogeneity in like a pre-period for these. Most of them come out as not statistically different from each other. I'll show you one type of heterogeneity here with retail. That seems to fine. Okay, so search is the gateway to the broader internet. Let's look at what's happening to the broader internet. If we just look at the total amount of web traffic to, not Google search type of traffic, and these are all kind of, we make sure to pass the data for foreground activity instead of background activity where your antivirus is calling out to the web. We're not going to see any effects on overall traffic. There's this masking heterogeneity according to the size of the website. So what we can do is break up our sample by the top 1,000 websites and the websites outside of the top 1,000, and we see pretty large declines, up to 40%-ish, on those niche websites. So we can do it by top and not top 1,000, or bottom quartile and top quartiles. These are the event studies for those. We can also kind of just hone in. It's the same story about the niche websites, but we can confirm that there's fewer traffic being referred from Google to these niche websites specifically. So, and this is kind of consistent with the Google search results. If you're searching for a question type search, you might be more likely to land on a niche website addressing your particular search query, whereas it doesn't look like people are changing their behavior when it comes to Facebook or TikTok and those types of sites. Okay, so closing the loop, so people are visiting website less. Does this actually matter? Does this matter for advertising? We're going to see, yes, there is a decline in exposure to ads, specifically Google type ads. We also measure another provider called Yieldmo. What we're going to find when we try to disentangle what types of ads are affected is that we're going to see search ads are not affected, or at least the detectable effects are not statistically significantly different from zero. And it's only going to show up in the display ads. So display ads being the ads that appear on actual websites. So this is consistent with those niche websites getting fewer traffic, and therefore those ad exposures decrease. Search ads might seem weird that there's no effects on search ads because we documented a decrease in search. But this is again can be consistent with the fact that we didn't find any decrease in navigational type queries. Actually, some of the most profitable types of ads to run is when you Google Amazon and Walmart's ad comes up. So those types of search behavior remain, and there's no effect on those ads.
Do you have the power to break this out by like where the display ads are placed? Like, should we think that it's like the shitty over-advertised blogs that are the ones that?
It probably is a lot of that,
and not like on news, like big news websites.
Yeah. So the thing with looking at the websites outside the top 1,000 is there's about how
No, I
many?
just wondered if you could interact these, like, with this, just with these binary splits, like top versus not top.
Yes, and we do see.
Okay, yeah, so it's all driven by the non-top, or?
Yes, and we can pick, so it's a little bit tricky here. We can pick up a decrease in ads if we try to attribute an ad to a niche website. There's a decrease in those types of ads. There's actually a decrease in the ads attributed to top websites as well. But we think there's contamination going on there. So, we observe the timestamped URL activity, but Facebook, for example, kind of always pings pretty consistently, whereas and when you try to attribute an ad to a particular website, a lot of it can get attributed to the top websites, which we think that's a misattribution. Also because there's no Google ads on Facebook. We tried to think about, can we look at the websites, what's in these, we could, sample the 4 million, but we're just, we haven't looked at
the break out by pre-period frequency of advertising.
Yes, yeah, yeah. The attribution, the problem with attributing an ad to, yeah. But,
So,
yes.
There is this practice of arbitrage, right? You advertise to get somebody's attention, not many people click, but if you click, and then you show like 100 ads on the web page.
Yeah.
And the advertisers who are not monitoring their campaigns carefully enough don't realize the setting that they're paying for. And so I just really like that idea of stratifying the publishers by advertising intensity.
Okay, yeah. Yes. We can definitely stratify on the publisher level.
Yeah.
We don't see what the advertiser is through the URL. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of it that there is. Kyle.
Yeah, related question to earlier about perishability. So like one of the aspects right now, digital advertising is AI optimization. That would be other names for it. Like the idea that I can use SEMrush and other tools to do the same kind of thing I used to be able to search. Right. So these data are from 2022 and
2023.
You think AI will change this?
So are you thinking about how effectively advertisers are targeting and using that might be affecting our results?
No, I'm saying like it's quite possible to structure your website to make it more discoverable.
Yeah. So I think that's a huge area. None of what we're doing really addresses it because during this period, no ads on LLMs.
Just put back to my question on perishability. Do you feel like these results are true now?
So I think people are still struggling with the monetization problem. That's evolved for sure. So Cloudflare, for example, was trying to build a system so that when an LLM accesses a website, there's a payment for that access. That's exactly spawned by this observation that these niche websites are no longer getting direct human traffic and fewer ad exposures. And so you shouldn't be paid for those. Well, you're reaching a fewer smaller audience.
I have a quick question. So a lot of the results here, interesting but fairly noisily estimated.
Yes.
Is there a way to characterize just descriptively who are the adopters of these things that he said earlier? Like you have probably much better precision using pre-treatment variables and how the cohorts look like. Are these people who receive a lot of ads? Do they come from places or eyeballs that advertisers are interested on? Like, something that, maybe comes in the future in a lot of few slides.
Few slides.
Yeah, okay, great.
One of the ones we have enough power. Yeah, I'll show you. Oh, yeah. Just this point on display versus search advertising, it's roughly consistent with what's being reported on financial reports. Google's display side advertising has been shrinking for reason beyond LLMs, but it's consistent. Well, Ali. So we try to look at heterogeneity.
I asked it in the right slide, right?
Yeah. Perfect. there's a lot of heterogeneity we can try to look at. A lot of it we're underpowered for, or we can split our individuals by the amount of retail activity they had in the pre-period. We can't go back too far because of attrition. We'd be losing sample. And so we split it into terciles and look at the effects specifically for ads, again, to kind of get at this idea of, people, there's fewer ad exposures occurring. Are these for potentially valuable eyeballs? And here we're thinking about high retail activity users as very valuable eyeballs for retargeting and etc. And so we see still imprecisely estimated, to be honest, but like the effects are definitely concentrated amongst those that are potentially valuable eyeballs. Okay, so I think I've gone on for too much, but I'll very briefly talk about some of the specific domains. We might want to focus on education and user-generated content platforms. For education, these are the early adopters of LLMs, and as teachers, we're concerned about our students' use of these tools. We find pretty clear substitution or decreases in use of traditional education type websites. So all education websites see a pretty substantial decrease, like upwards of 90%. And we can also look at the variety of URL cores within the education websites. That also decreases. So they're reaching fewer variety in the websites. This is kind of consistent with those niche websites overall seeing a decrease. Learning management systems here is like Canvas, etc. They seem to be spending less time maybe doing assignments and things like that. Online learning platforms are things like Chegg and these other third-party websites. Again, we also see the decrease. These online learning platforms monetize in various different ways. We were expecting to see an effect for the types of platforms that monetize through ads. It tends to actually show up more for subscription-based or platforms that are selling to schools. So like your Cengages that do some exercise modules for students. In terms of user-generated content, things are going to be pretty null, or at least imprecisely estimated. We wanted to verify whether there was an effect on Stack Overflow because other work has demonstrated that Stack Overflow saw a massive decrease in actual activity. We do find it, but very few of our sample, our panelists actually go to Stack Overflow. This is a pretty layman kind of group. No effects on Wikipedia and Reddit. In terms of social media, again, we're too noisily estimated here to say anything much. All right. Skip that and conclude. So we think the way people are searching for information is changing online. Potentially, LLMs could be a complement to traditional search engines and increase search activity, but we find that it's a substitute. There's specifically decreases in question type searches, but not more navigational type searches. For overall web activity, it's the niche websites that are harmed. So the niche providers of content are not the ones seeing a reduction in traffic and also a reduction in ad exposure for their website. And it is the valuable eyeballs that are being affected by this LLM adoption. And so LLMs, substitutes, not complements, and that's all I have for you today.
All right. I want to start by thanking the organizers. This conference is a gem every year, so if become one of those can miss appointment. Thank you so much for including me in the program and particularly having me discuss a paper that, as you could probably tell, if we're for the talk, a lot of fun, a lot of interesting findings, a lot of kind of stimulating stuff that we can, I'll speculate a bit on and then offer some thoughts as well. So what I want to try to do with this is, on one end, discuss some of the robustness of the results, and obviously there's a lot to like in the paper. Another thing that I want to do, because the data is 2022, 2023, I want to try and convince you that this is not just a piece of tech history, like this is how things used to be a few years ago, but I think it is very informative about what's going on today, 3, 4, a couple of years later. All right, so the obvious part, Tai did an amazing job presenting this, so not a lot more for me to say there. It's a generally important and fun to read paper. It's a question that, if you're sitting in this room, you probably thought about on some level, right? What is ChatGPT substituting for? What is it complementing? Where is that traffic coming from? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? I think we all thought about this to some extent. The data window, as I said, starts in 2022. That's the launch, right? ChatGPT, as you probably remember, had an extremely successful launch, went from 0 users to 100 million faster than every other app in history. And that's basically the period that we're looking at. It's adoption of household track over time. You mentioned, ChatGPT. I mean, you know this well. ChatGPT at the time is not what it is now. Particularly, it was not yet a search engine. There was no retrieval, no uplinks. And so on one end, you can say, well, this is kind of an issue because it's a different product, right? It might not be as informative, but I think there's a clear plus here, which is that what we observe here is pure substitution. All right, the headline results. So I needed two really packed slides for the headline results because there's a lot of them. As you probably saw, I think in some sense each of the half slides, could be a paper by itself. So the first headline result is that search activity declined by about 22%. There's an interesting nugget there, is that the effect actually takes time to materialize. It takes about 5 months. I'm going to discuss that a little bit. This is concentrated in question words, either both short and long queries. You don't really see any effects for navigational searches like Reddit, which makes sense because at the time ChatGPT couldn't redirect you anywhere, so it really made no sense to just type a word in there. Okay. Total website traffic, there's no aggregate change, but the heterogeneity here is what's really interesting. So if you look at the top quartile, that's only 7 websites. I will see no measurable decline. If you look at the bottom, if you look at the long tail of website, that's a really huge effect. And this was shocking to me, very, almost a 42% decline. So when we talk about these small websites, the authors do a great job, like being careful about talking about welfare here. Is this a problem? Is this a good thing? Well, it depends. Some of these small websites are, niche blogs from experts that have a lot of value. Some of these are SEO farms. So the fact that these long tail of websites is declining, it's hard to say whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but for sure it's an interesting fact, right? It's increasing in concentration. Education is it broadly, whether it's through subscription, B2B, or ad supported. So, Tai already mentioned Chegg. I'm going to show you in a few slides what the CEO had to say when, in an earnings call in early 2023, when there's starting to be some panic, and Wall Street reacted quite fast to that. Stack Overflow loses. There's been papers specifically on Stack Overflow. This is kind of nests that in some sense. No effects on Wikipedia, no effects on Reddit, no social media effects either. Okay, ads. So total ad exposures fall, but this is concentrated on display. So no search declines, no video ad declines, and that was showing, if you look at Google, there's been a healthy rise in all of those year over year, but the exception is display ads, where there's been a decline now for a few years. And the display ad decline is larger for the most valuable users. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I think it's also like an interesting nugget in the paper. So what's generally new? I probably don't need to convince you about this, but what's generally new is the integration of all these websites and the fact that we can get a really exhaustive view of what these users are doing. There's an adjacent paper, again, the Stack Overflow one I just mentioned. There's a recent fracking paper. There's a Yu et al. Studying Wikipedia. They are looking at one slice of activity. Again, super important stuff. But this one is, trying to give us like the full picture. There's 3 caveats, and I think the first one I think is probably the more straightforward one is that, again, we're looking at ChatGPT in the early days. Right? So ChatGPT was a different product. It wasn't nearly as capable as now. So our use of it has changed. I think another part that's slightly less obvious, but still pretty natural, is that the users have also changed, right? The user composition, of the early adopters was quite different from what it is now. Another thing that's interesting here is that we cannot measure time, right? We cannot measure, for instance, we were using the internet, 5 hours a day. When something super interesting like ChatGPT appears, do we go up to 6 hours or not? Or do we keep the 5 hours fixed and we're just substituting out of other websites? There's not something that the Comscore website allows the author to answer, so they can look at substitution patterns within websites. And last, the LLM is still a black box in the sense that, they're not able to observe what people are actually asking. We can infer by, the websites that are not visiting, right? But it's impossible to get that part of the data. All right, so I'll start with 4 questions, and then I get to the part that I honestly think is more fun, and it's definitely more fun to work on, and it's, how this is reflected in data from the last few years. So the 4 questions, I think the obvious one, and one that I would expect, probably the referees asking is like, does this generalize to 2026? Is it just a piece of tech history, or is it something that's relevant, for 3-4 years later? The 20-week lag, I think, has some interesting explanation. The fact that Comscore is desktop only, many of you are kind of experts in tracking and all the issues that can arise where you can track a desktop or not mobile, stuff like that. And then the Stack Overflow versus Wikipedia asymmetry, right? We saw Stack Overflow really declining, no effects on Wikipedia. To the extent that these 2 platforms share some similarity, why is that? All right. So let's talk about the time dimension first. Of course, there's one obvious part, which is, again, ChatGPT is not what it used to be, and that we all understand. I think the other part that's slightly less obvious is that the users have changed just as much as the product has, right? So there's a recent working paper, MBR working paper with people from OpenAI in the paper. They're showing that the user composition has been changing. So if you look at typically feminine first names, there was from 37% in January 2024 to over 50%. So there's, I think it stands to reason that the early adopter pool was likely more male, more technical users, engineering heavy, and student heavy probably. Again, a lot of results on education probably speaks to that compared to the 2026 user base. And this matters because, of course, the sum of the substitution patterns that we're going to see reflect who's using it just as much as what ChatGPT is doing. So the second thing I want to say is, why does search decline only after around 5 months, right? So Fratkin has this recent paper where it shows that usage plateaus in weeks. So why don't we see it here? So Tai was telling me, I obviously knows infinitely more than I know about this, but that study looks at APIs, if I understand correctly. So this is not exactly
My understanding, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, so this is not exactly an apple with apple comparison. I think the more interesting, part of this slide is the second one, which is what's going on, right? Why is there a lag? And I think there's 2 potential explanations that seem reasonable to me. The first one is what I call task migration, right? Meaning that first we went to ChatGPT for stuff like summarizing, drafting, and stuff like that. And then as users started using ChatGPT for that and build trust in the platform, they started saying, okay, you know what? I think I'm going to start using it for search as well. That could be an option. The other one is that they started using ChatGPT for search from the get-go, but they didn't fully trust it. So at first there was a lot of verification on Google as kind of a 2-step procedure. And then when they saw that these results tend to match quite well, they decided, I don't need to do this 2-step procedure. I don't need to go to Google anymore. And therefore we start seeing this Google decline. All right. The third part rather is the issue of like measuring laptops and non-phones, right? Why does this matter? It matters because, as you know, ChatGPT launched a mobile app. This was about May 2023, and therefore a lot of the ChatGPT activity became mobile. Of course, this is gonna hit different type of activities very asymmetrically, right? If you're doing your homework, if you think about education, you're probably doing that on a laptop. You're not doing that on the phone, and so you're gonna see through the Comscore data a lot of substitution there. If it's stuff like casual search, social media, news that you're doing on your phone, by definition, we're not going to see effects on Comscore. So some of the results might be shaped by that. In that sense, I think the education estimates are likely some of the experience channels, whereas the search one maybe it could be a little bit more contaminated because a lot of search was happening on phones and therefore couldn't really be measured by Comscore. The last thing that I find interesting is this asymmetry between Wikipedia and Stack Overflow, right? Stack Overflow gets hit quite a bit. Again, there's specific papers on that, whereas Wikipedia, we see no effect. So why is that? The obvious explanation is, we're all familiar with hallucinations, right? So this is, it's kind of an unfair example, but it's unfair to UC Berkeley, but it's also unfair to the presentation because, obviously, as you can see, it's a Google Gemini, it's a Google AI overview hallucination, but obviously a huge reputational damage coming from misinformation of that sort. So one theory that's the theory that you propose is that, users really trust ChatGPT with coding questions, but not really with factual type matters. It's possible. I think the crowd selection here could also play a big role, right? Because the crowd at first was queuing young engineers, very technical. So it stands to reason that those people were there. So one I think relatively clean test is you start from the numbers here are huge. You start with 287 users that use Stack Overflow, right? Which number of those also use Wikipedia? Is it still true, right? That they stop using Stack Overflow, but they keep using Wikipedia, or if we restrict to that sample, then this asymmetry disappears. Obviously, the numbers might be small. Again, you start from less than 300. Once you take the intersection with Wikipedia, maybe you're in the low 100. But I think it's worth a look. All right, this is the more fun part. It's kind of what I call out of sample evidence, and basically saying, all right, in the last 3 years, what have we seen that suggests that some of the patterns that we've seen in this paper actually generalized and continued over time. The first one is the tragedy of Chegg, right? So you mentioned Chegg is an education platform. It was one of the kind of Wall Street darlings, in 2021, 2022. This was an earnings call from May 2023, where the CEO comes out and says, in the last few months, I wasn't really worried about this. Stuff was going pretty well for us. But now I believe that ChatGPT is really having an impact on our traffic. So now I'm starting to be worried. Right? The stock dropped 48% that day, and since then it dropped another 90+%. So it's basically been wiped out. And Chegg, I think, is one of the most prominent victims of ChatGPT. So this is something that has been kind of, I think, compounded over the years. And I think, obviously it's going to be interesting to look at the Coursera's of the world and the Duolingos and stuff like that. The second one, and you've mentioned this, is if we look at Google, right? Google has been, obviously healthy and growing at a healthy pace. Search hasn't shown any sign of slowing down. Video ads the same, but Google networks, meaning display ads, that's the part that's been slowing down. In this particular case, it's a 3% decrease. You might say, okay, this might just be a quarter. Who cares? It turns out 13 quarters in a row we saw this decline, right? So I see this as a fairly anecdotal but a nice ex post validation for some of the paper's predictions. Another thing that I think really helps the paper and helps, I think, quantifying the importance of the paper for 2025 or 2026 is this study that came out of Pew Research, where they look at Google specifically. So they're not looking at ChatGPT, but they're looking at something that should be similar, right? We expect something similar, and we find something similar indeed, right? So the click-through rate to traditional results, it's about 8% with AI summary versus 15% without. So obviously there's a drop in traffic there. The click on a link inside an AI summary is only 1% of the time. Session ending, AI summaries, and so on and so forth. Okay, so it's exactly the same mechanism that the paper documents, but in a Google native environment, right? And 2 years later, importantly, when these technologies were a lot more developed. I think, as I said before, one of the most striking findings here is that the big websites are fine, right? The top 7, top quartile websites are doing just fine. They're not losing anything. The bottom quartile, they're getting pretty slaughtered, right? 42% decline, which I think is one of the most arresting figures in the paper. So this was really a case where the big websites at some point learned how to react to this and started signing deals. Obviously, there's two sides of this, right? One is the traffic, and one is how you monetize in other ways. We've seen examples of this, the Atlantic, Box, News Corporation reported deal with OpenAI. New York Times, they couldn't reach a deal, but similarly, they went to court. So the big publishers were able to negotiate into this LLM ecosystem. The small ones really had no bargaining power whatsoever, and they just got killed by that. So summing up, it's a highly valuable paper on a rare data set. I think, again, it's the type of paper that as you read it, first of all, it's easy to read, it's fun to read. It's packed with facts that are interesting, and I think we can all relate because it's, we are probably all heavy users of ChatGPT and Claude and all the likes. So we are aware of the fact that our time that's going there is not going somewhere else. So there's definitely a little bit of introspection there. The display versus search ad prediction lines up really well with Google evidence from years later. Again, the Pew 2025 AI overview evidence also very much in line. And so the external validity here, obviously, again, there's in some sense two issues that you need to, not issues, but like two aspects that you need to convince the audience about. Again, one is ChatGPT changed a lot. The other one is that the user changed a lot. But despite that, I think everything, all the facts that we're seeing in the last couple of years, I think point in the direction that what you found with data from the early users is going to generalize quite well moving forward. So I cannot say enough good things about this paper. It's highly recommend a read. You can probably tell it's a fun one, and I think it's going to generate a lot of follow-up studies. Again, there's a lot of breadth here. I think we can zoom in a lot of these aspects, and there's papers within each of those. So really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Tommaso, for an amazing discussion, and I love all the additional facts you pulled out. We're definitely gonna incorporate a lot of those external evidence paper. I really like the suggestion about doing the cross on people who use Stack Overflow and Wikipedia. It might be the case we are actually how if the text is strong enough for those particular set of users. So I think that's a great, and also like the verification, thinking about it as learning process, initially 2 steps, 1 step. I really like that as well. But yeah, otherwise that's what I have. Thanks.